Another consumer measure just crashed. One of the biggest misses in its 46-year history. Why? The same theme we keep coming back to over and over again. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Now, some of it was recent price increases, no surprise given the behavior of gasoline and insurance, but the big one, unemployment. Huge increase in Americans reporting they're afraid of losing their jobs, the most in over a decade. And it isn't just this one survey or another survey. Unemployment is now in all of the surveys. And we've heard this from companies talking about weak consumers. There's a growing list of data on the labor market suggesting the economy has already been dealing with half a recession for some time. Now you put it all together, and the chances of going full-blown are the highest they've been this entire cycle. And ultimately, that's what we're talking about. All along, as long as it has taken, it has remained a cycle anyway. It's like gravity pulling you toward the event horizon of a black hole. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Once you're stuck in its orbit, you're along for the ride. But as you're swinging around the black hole, sometimes it feels like you're able to break free, when in fact, you're actually stuck in that orbiting cycle, moving lower and lower and lower all the time until eventually you get there. Now, what the data we got today was University of Michigan's consumer confidence. And it was expected to fall maybe a point or so. Instead, it dropped by nearly 10, going from 77.2 in April to 67.4 for May. Preliminary data here. That's not just a 6-month low and the lowest in November. It is, by many accounts, the biggest miss to expectations in the entire history. And we can see the survey going back and forth along with oil prices. Sentiment was down from July to November as WTI was picking up last year. So consumer prices, pressures on the economy, all of that stuff, consumer sentiment goes down. But then it rebounded in December and January after the oil crash and the bond rally. People were thinking more disinflation again. But then, unfortunately, geopolitics and oil supply, all of that stuff, WTI and gasoline especially start to rebound in the early part of this year. Consumer confidence suddenly levels off in February and March, at least according to the Michigan survey. But then April, the measure moves down, and now in May, there's an absolute crash, down 10 points, 67.4. And it's not just prices, though. Now, more and more, the constant theme we keep coming back to, consumers as well as businesses talking about jobs. Consumers from the perspective of losing their jobs, and businesses saying, we've kind of had enough here. We have to start getting rid of workers, whether we want to or not. What the University of Michigan said about the latest report was, this 10 index point decline is statistically significant and brings sentiment to its lowest reading in about 6 months. This month's trend in sentiment is characterized by a broad consensus across consumers, with decreases across age, income, and education groups. While consumers had been reserving judgment for the past few months, they now perceive negative developments on a number of dimensions. They expressed worries that inflation, unemployment, and interest rates may all be moving in an unfavorable direction over the year ahead. And it's the middle one there, unemployment, that's the one that keeps coming up over and over. We've been talking about consumer prices and pressures in all of these surveys for quite a long time. But the new one that keeps showing up, the new entrant onto the scene, that's unemployment, jobs, incomes. And for the University of Michigan in their survey, there was a net 31 percentage points more people saying that they expect higher unemployment in the next year than say there will be less. And that's the biggest difference since 2011. More saying they're afraid of unemployment than not. That's higher than at any point in 2022 and the first half of 2023. During the banking crisis, the recession scare that we had, and the initial downturn period, it's even more than in 2020 or at any time in the 2010s. So suddenly consumers are saying, we're increasingly afraid of losing our jobs, and there's no banking crisis to blame it on, nor all of the massive oil price increases in 2022. There's something else happening here. And it's just the continued slide in the economy as this cycle keeps playing out in the same way. There's lots of twists and turns along the way, but overall the trend remains in that direction. Commenting on the shocking drop in consumer confidence, according to the Michigan survey, in CNBC, they reported, All things considered, however, the magnitude of the slump in confidence is pretty big, and it isn't satisfactorily explained by geopolitical factors or the mid-April stocks market sell-off, at least according to Paul Ashworth, chief North American economist at Capital Economics. That leaves us wondering if we're missing something more worrying going on with the consumer. Yes, the consumer has been suggesting signs, and there's been other signs too, but consumers in particular have been showing signs of substantial weakness. Different kind of weakness than we've become used to over the last couple of years. And it really goes back to September and October last year. We keep pointing this out. September and October last year was a crucial inflection point. There has been a whole host of indications suggesting that we've been moving in this direction the entire time. And it has been spreading further and further afield all along the way. While everybody's focused on CPIs and oil prices for obvious reasons and understandable reasons, on the other side of things, the actual U.S. economy, the conditions outside of consumer prices don't look anything like consumer prices. And that's the problem in interpretation that we keep coming back to here. And one of the reasons why these people talk to CNBC and say that they're surprised about this weakness. Because as all anyone has heard is inflationary economy. The U.S. is strong and resilient. How can consumers actually be struggling when the labor market is this robust? Suddenly, consumers are talking about unemployment. Some of the labor numbers look really bad. But it's not all of a sudden. It's been building all along. Underneath this narrative of a soft landing and hot inflationary economy, the real economy is nothing like the CPI. In fact, the CPI is accelerating the transition to this other economy, accelerating the downside to the supply shock. And we've seen it again in a whole range of data. Remember the Conference Board, just a couple weeks ago, the Conference Board reported its consumer confidence number, and that was the lowest it had been of this cycle. And what did the Conference Board blame for falling consumer confidence? They said confidence retreated further in April, reaching its lowest level since July 2022, as consumers became less positive about the current labor market situation and more concerned about future business conditions, job availability, and income. And just to put an exclamation point on it, their expectations index fell to 66.4, which, as they pointed out, anything less than 80 signals a high chance of a forthcoming recession. Consumers are cracking because the jobs market may be cracking. That wasn't the only one. I pointed out just recently, the ISM, the non-manufacturing services. This isn't just a manufacturing thing. The vast majority of the U.S. economy, services. Here's a big one, sentiment indicator. Looking ahead, services. The index fell below 50, which almost never happens outside a recession. It happened in December of 2022 due to cold weather, but also a combination of weakness. But here we are falling since last September and October. Now ISM services under 50. And one of the key reasons it was under 50, employment. The employment index fell below 46, another solid recession indicator in the respect of employment and jobs. And on it goes. S&P Global, we talked about that, their preliminary data, and then of course followed up with the full data for the month of April. S&P Global said it wasn't just manufacturing there either, services as well, pointing to employment. Signs of demand weakness impacted hiring plans at companies in the U.S. at the start of the second quarter. A number of respondents indicated that they had held off on backfilling positions following the departure of staff. As a result, employment decreased for the first time since June 2020, and they also added this. The overall reduction in workforce numbers was centered on services where employment decreased solidly and to the largest extent since mid-2020. So American consumers aren't just pulling this out of nowhere. It's everywhere. It's widespread. And as I mentioned in the introduction, they've already been suffering under half a recession for quite some time, really going back to last fall. The JOLTS numbers, not job openings, forget job openings, that's a worthless, faulty statistic. The hiring estimates, the level of hiring in the U.S. economy has plummeted, especially when you adjust it for population growth. The hiring rate is as low as it has been since 2016. We're talking going a long way back. It's about even to the middle of 2008. It's equal or just a little bit above the lowest level in the aftermath of the dot-com recession. There's been a widespread hiring freeze all across the economy for some time, and consumers can sense it. And it has an impact on not just consumer spending or consumer confidence, it has an impact on businesses. They're now more likely to look at their labor, their payrolls, and say, maybe we need to trim. And they have been trimming. Not only have they've been forced to stop hiring new workers, they've also been cutting hours of the workers they have on their payrolls already. And there's been more. The recent payroll data itself, for the month of April, a stumble. That doesn't necessarily mean much by itself, but again, in combination with all the rest of that, including the household survey. Over the last 7 months, the household survey has been negative. When the 7 months before that, it was at least positive by almost 1.2 million to 1.3 million jobs. Now it's negative over its 7-month period. It sounds exactly like what Americans are telling these survey takers, whether it be the University of Michigan, the Conference Board, or anyone else. And it matches everything else. And the thing is, even the Federal Reserve saw that inflection developing as it was happening last year. I'll give you an example. In November of 2023, Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Wallace said, "I am encouraged by what we have learned in the past few weeks. Something appears to be giving, and it's the pace of the economy." See, inflection point. Data for October indicated an easing in economic activity, and forecasts for the fourth quarter show the kind of moderation that is more in keeping with progress on lowering inflation. Now, according to the Fed's view, they saw that change, that slowdown, and thought, well, this is just coming down from a red-hot second half of last year, the big GDP, 5% in the third quarter. And therefore was nothing more concerning than just a moderate slowdown as the economy gently glides into its disinflationary soft landing. But as it has turned out, with the benefit of more hindsight and perspective, and what consumers are telling us and what the data is telling us, it was an inflection, but not a gentle soft landing, but maybe the start of a half recession turning into the full recession. And the full recession is nothing more than the last part of it, which is the layoffs. And there have been any number of reasons why this cycle has taken as long as it has, and I've gone over these repeatedly, and it's worth repeating again. Primary among them, labor hoarding. And so all of these indications that we're getting, whether it be sentiment and data, suggest that maybe labor hoarding has reached its limit too. Half recession then becomes full recession. But a lot of people aren't quite ready to make that transition because, again, they've been surprised by all this, thinking red hot economy, inflation, how can we be talking about unemployment? So the narrative is slowly shifting from inflation economy to maybe this must be stagflation. Not everybody's ready to let go of consumer prices. Several media outlets reported a quote from Jeff Roach from LPL Financial, which basically said, here, I'll read it to you. "Uncertainty about the inflation path could suppress consumer spending in the coming months." No, that's not what's happening. The Fed is walking a tightrope as they balance mandates of price stability and growth. Although it's not our base case, we do see rising risk of stagflation, a concern that markets will have to deal with. And that's the narrative shifting. Went from it's all inflation, that's the only thing to worry about. Now it's stagflation. And stagflation is simply this idea that we still have inflation risk because Jay Powell said so. But at the same time, we can see that the economy isn't as red hot and robust as we thought. That's the stag part starting to seep into the narrative. So now we have a weaker economy than we thought, but we must still have consumer price pressures. We still have inflation to deal with. Now we got the weaker economy on top of it. And the University of Michigan survey did report some data that suggested that very thing. Their consumer price expectations for the next year ahead, those moved up to 3.5%, which is the highest since November. And even the 5-year long-run expectation jumped up to 3.1%. Well, it didn't jump, but it was slightly higher at 3.1%, suggesting, okay, we've got more consumer price expectations as well as this recession risk that's developing. There's your stagflation. But that 3.5% is well below what it had been in November, 4.5%. And consumer price expectations simply follow along with oil and gasoline prices. So if we go from the half recession that we have now to a full recession in the future, as more and more data suggests, then consumer price expectations, like consumer price measures themselves, are not going to look so inflationary. So we'll be stuck with the stag with a different sort of inflation attached to it, which will not be the inflation part. And of course, all of this is perfectly consistent with what we've been talking about this entire time in the marketplace. Interest rates want to go down. The only thing that's blocking them is the Federal Reserve and its fixation on the CPI. Jay Powell is afraid of being criticized of the CPI, so he's talking about inflation risk, when all the rest of the stuff suggests that the economy is weakening and substantially weaker than he anticipates and appreciates. So interest rates would go down. They'd go down to where, as I mentioned in a recent video, where the interest rate swap market would have them. The interest rate swap spreads suggest that we have the fundamental basis, the fundamental economy for very low interest rates. That's not inflation. That's not stagflation. That's the downside of the supply shock inevitably reaching its ultimate conclusion. The one that we've been pulled toward like gravity this entire time. The fact that it's taken so long to get in this position has understandably left people to wonder if it was ever going to happen at all. Just like in the 1970s, during what many people considered stagflation, which was really just a rough economy tied to actual legitimate inflation, what did interest rates do in the 70s? They went up. The only reason interest rates have gone up at all over the last couple of years is because of the Federal Reserve and its rate hikes. You take away the rate hikes, what do interest rates look like? They look like what interest rate swaps already do. And that's why the curve is inverted. That's why many curves have been pointing toward lower interest rates all along. Now the economic data and the sentiment data, the soft and hard statistics together are telling you why that would be. As the U.S. economy gets weaker, joining your counterparts around the rest of the world, now it's understandable why interest rates would want to go lower and seek to go lower as soon as they realize, as soon as they're confident, that Jay Powell is confident about inflation risk and will get the Fed out of the way with his influence on the short end of the curve. The data is moving in that direction. Because ultimately that's what matters here. It's not one thing or another. It's how much of this is moving from one side to the other. From everything is fine, soft landing, to now, at least according to the mainstream narrative, we have to worry about stagflation, which again is just nothing more than the transition from red hot economy to not red hot economy. It looks like stagflation only so long as the CPI, driven by oil prices, continues to be elevated. What we're seeing more and more and more, especially all these references to employment, really unemployment, jobs, incomes, fears over all of those, is nothing more than that transition. The transition from the supply shock that everybody mistook for a full recovery to not the supply shock. And as I've said, the markets have suggested that the 2020s, once we get past the early part of the 2020s, the rest of the 2020s end up looking more like the 2010s, if not worse. And so to get there, we have to go through this transition period. And this transition period has been incredibly prolonged and elongated by a number of factors. Among those factors, Uncle Sam's transfers, the hiring boom among governments, especially state governments, that may be coming to an end. But most of all, labor hoarding. And so that's what's really the real takeaway from all of this. Now we've got consumers as well as companies, company reports. We've got data on the labor market, and all of it suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the labor hoarding is indeed coming to an end. And if it does, if that's what's happening, then we'll complete the transition from the supply shock to this baseline that looks more like the 2010s. We have half a recession already. Companies are experiencing enough of the downturn that they've completely stopped hiring. So if labor hoarding really is done, that's the other half. And it seems more and more like the evidence is pointing in that direction. It isn't one thing or another. It's from all these perspectives all across the spectrum. The economy sucks, and it's about to suck a whole lot more. I mentioned the fundamental of swaps and swap spreads and what we can learn from them, and not just about the interest rate market either. That's the video got linked below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. And until next time, take care.